And welcome to episode 15 of the David Bernard Podcast. I'm along with Fox 8 meteorologist Zach Fradella. Today, we've got an interesting topic today, Zach. What if I told you there is a method that could reasonably and accurately predict weather patterns up to 300 days away? And not just patterns, specific storms and maybe even hurricanes. Well, there's a man out there that believes it, he's researched it, and he uses it. Today we're going to speak with Gary Lezak. Gary has been a good friend of mine for many years. He's the chief meteorologist for the Embassy affiliate in Kansas City. And Gary's been studying this for decades, a hypothesis. This was first observed by another meteorologist 70, almost 80 years ago. It's known as the cycling pattern hypothesis. In short, the belief is there are patterns in the atmosphere that repeat in such a way that forecasts for mainly, I would say, big weather events can be foreseen up to almost a year in advance, 300 days. And that number 300 is significant, and we're going to talk to Gary about that. Gary, through his own observation and research, has coined it the Lezak recurring cycle. And he's been studying this and using it since the 1980s.
The l.R.C. We've been talking about this. You and I have been talking about this for over a year now. And this is some interesting stuff. I'm really excited about today's podcast because I want to know more. I mean, as meteorologists, studying any type of scientific things that can help us better understand what's going on and maybe forecast in advance, that's all great. And we've known, we learned about this in school. You have teleconnections. You have the El Nino, La Nina. We know about all of these long-term type impacts that can have on the weather, but we don't have something that specifically can point to, hey, maybe this might be a reoccurring time that you could see a storm, or in this case, a hurricane. That's what we're more kind of in tune to, like a specific point of the year or a specific point of hurricane season where we need to watch for maybe a hurricane strike. That's what this kind of goes along those lines. And so that's why I'm excited to learn a little bit more and see exactly how this all comes to be and how, he figured this out in the long run.
Well, there are a number of examples that he can point to over the years, and especially we're going to hone in on tropical activity. Obviously, that's of great interest to us here along the Gulf Coast. We also have on today's podcast Eric Burris, and Eric is a broadcast meteorologist in Orlando, and he has studied Gary's atmospheric recurring cycle theory, and he even uses it at his own local station. So we're going to get his feedback on how that's gone over at the station and with his fellow meteorologists and viewers in Central Florida.
And right now we actually have Fred out there. We've been tracking Fred for the past several days, and Fred is part of this whole cycle. And that's one reason why I was looking at Eric's social media accounts and whatnot, and he's been saying, hey, mid-August, we have to watch out in Florida. And sure enough, Fred's forecast right now takes it towards Florida. So that's part of that whole l.R.C., the cycle.
And I guess we should point out today is August 12, 2021, when this is being recorded. And as Zach pointed out, we have Fred, which is of this hour, a depression just off the coast of Cuba. I guess the thoughts are, what do you think is going to happen with Fred? It looks like it's going to stay off the Cuban coastline. That's the first good thing you can say going for Fred.
Yeah, and it's going right through the mountains of Hispaniola, and it looks bad. It's just a swirl of clouds right now. There's really no thunderstorm activity. But now it's back over water, and it looks like it's going to ride the coast of Cuba till the Florida Straits. And so we should see it probably organized back into a tropical storm. But right now, all indications are this is going to be an Eastern Gulf type of storm that we're going to be watching into the weekend.
And this may come into play as well. Behind that, we have Invest Area 95 over the central Atlantic.
That's another one, and this is the time of year. We've been talking about this the past several weeks that, look, the switch is going to flip. We're getting to that peak hurricane season. August 20th, that's when Dr. Gray used to ring that bell, and that's where we're getting towards. So we're going to have another one. The next name on the list would be Grace if Invest 90L, which is in the central Atlantic, actually ever develops down the line.
Well, remember, you can always watch this podcast on fox8live.com/David. We have a video version, and if you're watching the video version and you want to listen to the rest of it in your car or on one of your favorite podcast apps, we're on all the various podcast apps, Spotify, Apple, and several others in addition to that. So on that note, let's bring in today's guests, Gary Lezak and Eric Burris. Gary and Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
I think this is going to be an exciting discussion. I made a very brief description of the cycling pattern hypothesis during our introduction here a few moments ago, but we want to hear it from you, Gary. To begin with, who is Jerome? Now I'm going to mess it up.
Namais.
Jerome Namais. Let's start with him.
He was head of the Weather Bureau, the Long Range Forecasting Division of the Weather Bureau in the 1940s and 1950s, and he developed this thing. He published a couple hundred papers in a couple books, and one of them was called the index cycle. And I stumbled across his work when I was writing my peer-reviewed paper on the cycling pattern hypothesis, which is known as the l.R.C. But Dr. Fred Carr said, "Have you ever heard of Jerome Namais?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You should read this paper called the index cycle. It sounds similar to your hypothesis." So I read through it, and he was close to what my theory is. And he had discovered that by November, there's enough information in the weather patterns to know what's going to happen the following winter. And for some reason, for weeks at a time, a cycle can exist. But what he didn't realize is that that entire cycle repeats over and over and over again, all the way till October when the new pattern sets up. So, but he is the first one that I know of that actually had something similar to what we're sharing with you today here.
So when we talk about the cycling pattern hypothesis, dig in just a little bit more about what we're talking about, because we're gonna talk so meteorologists out there will understand, but also for folks that aren't meteorologists that are listening, we're talking about using patterns globally to predict this, correct?
Right. There's basics to what the cycling pattern hypothesis is, which our bloggers back in 2002, 2003 actually named it after me, the Lezak recurring cycle, or the l.R.C. I just call it my hypothesis. They thought it should have a name, so it stuck as the l.R.C. And what I had developed in the 1980s, behind me on my wall, you might see this mural of pictures. And that's when I first sort of discovered it, or firmed up what this was all about in 1987 and 1988. There was a major 1-foot snowstorm in Oklahoma City, and they only average 8 inches of snow a year. And about 5-6 weeks later, 7 weeks later, there was another 1-foot snowstorm in Oklahoma City. Not to mention ice storms and major winter, almost like what they just had this past winter. And I noticed that the pattern that produced the major snowstorm, the second one, looked awfully similar to the first one. And I was beginning to realize then that there was a relationship. Years later, fast forward to 2002, 2003, 15 years later, I developed the hypothesis where a pattern sets up every early fall, late September, early October, around October 5th, 6th, or 7th is when it really begins. And it becomes established, and these things called anchor ridges and troughs set up. And they tell you where storm systems are going to reach peak strength and weakest strength, where the anchor ridges are weakest and where the anchor troughs are where the storms are strongest. And then the pattern sets up. There's a cycle that develops. This year's cycle just happens to be about 46 to 47 days. Every year is different. So this fall, a brand new pattern will set up that's never happened before. And then the entire pattern repeats. So it's not just the tropics that follow this. Everything within the northern hemisphere does. So from China, Japan, where the Tokyo Olympics were, across Europe, all the way to the United States, North America, Mexico, the entire pattern is under the influence of this cycling pattern, and you can make predictions based off of it. That's basically what it is all about.
What is the significance of October?
I'm not exactly 100% certain. I've got an idea. The sun sets at the North Pole on the autumnal equinox. So this every year, autumnal equinox, the sun sets at the North Pole. But here, in Louisiana and Florida and Kansas City, we have about an hour of twilight, and then it gets dark. At the North Pole, it's about 10 days to 2 weeks of twilight, and then it gets dark. It finally is dark at the North Pole. Right about the time that it goes to total darkness is right around the time, October 5th, 6th, or 7th, 2 weeks after the solstice, the vernal equinox, and that's about the time. So there's got to be some astronomical cause or reason if that hypothesis is correct. But something like that happens in the fall that starts the pattern, and then it exists until the next fall.
All right, Zach, you've been following Eric's Twitter feed and kind of getting some insight into how he's using this.
Yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, this is Eric, and he's a broadcast meteorologist in Orlando, and I've been following you, Eric, for a while now. I tune into your coffee talks and whatnot every morning, and I know earlier in the spring you posted, okay, these are the reoccurring parts of the L.R.C. and when we need to watch during hurricane season. How did you come about Gary's hypothesis, and how's this played out?
So I work for a television station in Orlando, but I also work with weather departments all across the country. And so I met a gentleman by the name of Jeremy Nelson, who worked with Gary several years ago. And so Gary taught Jeremy the L.R.C. And Jeremy and I have become friends over the years. And it started off with Jeremy just saying, highlight these days, there's going to be something tropical around you. And I said, but that's 6 months from now. How could you possibly have a clue? And he said, just do it and I'll tell you later. So he took it on the approach of, I'm going to blow your mind and then we'll backfill it with information. And after a couple of years of him doing this, I finally said, okay, Mr. Magic, teach this to me. You're not David Copperfield. And so he started kind of teaching me the basics. And, I worked through it for several years, and it got to the point where I wanted to do this on my morning broadcasts on my Twitter feed, and Jeremy put me in touch with Gary, and now I'm so honored to say that Gary and I will shoot messages back and forth. David, like you, today I've had Gary on my morning broadcast talking about the L.R.C. We've even talked about this year's hurricane forecast, and the more I've used it, the more I feel like my head explodes, because as Gary, as you've said, there is chaos in the atmosphere, but there is organization to that chaos.
Okay, well let's get right into this, and for us along the Gulf Coast, and certainly for Eric in Central Florida, it is hurricane season, and the part about the L.R.C. that interests me the most is exactly that, and for obvious reasons. We're not dealing with snowstorms on the Gulf Coast traditionally. Widespread tornado outbreaks really aren't our thing. It's hurricane season, and Gary, let's start talking, and Eric, about 2020, what happened last year, what's already happened this year, and what may be happening or is happening in the next week, and explain. And so what I'm going to talk about is I want to talk about Hurricane Iota from 2020, Elsa this year, and what Elsa may have to do with Fred that's currently over Cuba. How does the L.R.C. explain these three storms?
Well, the weather pattern sets up in October and November. So Iota happened around November the 10th or so. And so when Iota developed, you apply the L.R.C. to it, and then it's about a 46 to 47 day cycle this year, and it will come out to right about mid-August for a system. But not just mid-August, 46 days earlier was late June and early July. So exactly 46 days ago, right now, we had a system forming. It was Elsa that took a very similar path. I used the track of Iota to predict where Elsa would likely go, and it took a path very close to that. Once a system forms in hurricane season, like Elsa, it increases the probability, and I've done a 21-year analysis of hurricane seasons, it increases the probability of a stronger named system to form in another L.R.C. cycle, which would be right now or in early October. So this part of the pattern is going to cycle through one more time before the whole new weather pattern sets up, and there could be a major hurricane at that point heading towards Florida. So something to monitor for early October. But right now, Fred is over land. It's having a hard time going. When it gets close to the Keys and just west of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's hard for the west coast of Florida to get hit. But this year's target is the west coast of Florida, predicted in February, if not way back last November, and it's happening. And that's the part that Eric would agree, we get blown away by it, even though I predict it and expect it, and it's happening.
I'll say this. I'm blown away because, Eric, I saw your graphic months ago where you highlighted the west coast of Florida, and you were saying late June, early July, which was Elsa, and then you said mid-August, which relates to the hypothesis. And what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, and then again, using that history also assists in talking about local impact. So, for example, while we may not be talking about a major hurricane in our area, I did an hour-long broadcast this morning, and my entire question list was, what's going to happen in my county? What's going to happen in my county? And it helps me to say, right now, it looks like a very similar influence of what the last cycle yielded, which was Elsa. So think about Elsa. It was a breezy day. It was a cloudy day. We had some tropical downpours. But it also lets me say the next cycle, that late September, early October, when the water temperatures are at their peak, when theoretically the Madden-Julian oscillation should, all these other pieces of the puzzle come together, that may be the one that's the big one that we really are going to have to get into more hurricane concern. So it also helps to tell kind of this weather story of comparing to the past, but also letting you know, hey, if you're thinking about vacations, if you're thinking about this or that, come early October, just put a little asterisk in the back of your mind, and like Jeremy told me, circle on the calendar that early October time frame as we're going to be doing this all over again, the same but subtly different.
Okay, this is great. Eric knows when to schedule vacations. That's a wonderful secondary benefit here of the L.R.C. But Gary, I want to ask you. So you said the cycle this year is 46.3 days or something like that for the repetition. What determines the cycle, and are there cycles within the cycle each year? If that makes sense.
There's what are called harmonics of the cycle. So. Like a lot of cycling things, if you have a 60-day cycle, then you'll have a 30-day harmonic, a 15-day harmonic, a 7.5-day harmonic, all the way down to a 1-day harmonic. There are these other subsets of those cycles, but you have one predominant cycle. So in October and November, let's say there's a major storm that hits the Chicago area. It's a huge storm where there's a severe weather outbreak, there's a snowstorm. You look for that pattern to return, and 46, 47 days later this year, the pattern returns, and it's hard to see because it looks like chaos, but it's not. It's very, very organized. So you can also, if it's 60 days or like 46 days, cut it in half. 23 days, you'll see some hints or reflections of the bigger pattern as well. And so, and you might have little mini cycles within that cycle that repeat over 7 days, but overall, it's one big pattern that's cycling.
Now, listeners, I think, our listeners are predominantly northern Gulf Coast, southeast Louisiana, south Mississippi. We're talking October last year, and we know what happened in October in our area. We had Delta into southwest Louisiana, and we had Zeta right into the New Orleans metropolitan area. Are those part of this cycle, and when do we need to watch?
Delta's October 4th to October 10th. Zeta was October 28th or so, as I think it came into Louisiana, right near New Orleans, I think. Yeah. So it was a Category 3 storm at that point. So that would be due around, I don't know, did you do your calculation? I think that Delta...
Eric has it. Eric's got to have it.
Delta's going to be around
so you've got Delta,
August 24th to September 2nd, right?
Yeah, right at the end. And then again, you've got Zeta about mid-September.
Right. I got 13th to the 23rd of September is when that part of the pattern will cycle through, and that's right near the peak of hurricane season. So my concern, not that it will be a Katrina, we need to see some evidence. This season, so far, there has not been a strong hurricane yet. It's early. It's early still. Mm-hmm. But in the next 2 or 3 weeks, let's see if we start having a strong hurricane somewhere in the Atlantic or the Caribbean. It will have a reflection in past cycles. But if this season might be one that doesn't have stronger systems, there's usually a hint of them early when it's going to be a major season. It still is early, August the 12th or so. So in the next 2 weeks, it's something to monitor. But Zeta, September 13th to 23rd for New Orleans, you guys can start preparing now. And this includes the hotel industry, transportation, shipping. This includes every business that's impacted by weather.
Now hold on,
this, don't you think?
Yeah. Now
well,
Gary
didn't Zeta already do something this season, Gary?
Well, I was going to ask him about Klaudette, but just hold on a minute for everybody listening. So, Gary, you know that Zach and I are going to have our listeners and our viewers on top of all this. They're going to know well ahead of time if there's going to be a threat, and we're prepared for hurricanes down here. It's a year-round type thing. So, I mean, we've got that part under control. But let's. I just didn't want to overly, I guess, panic people listening that this is definitely going to happen.
Don't say Katrina down here.
Well, the chance of a Katrina is probably once in a 100-year storm, so probably that's not going to happen. Once in a 500-year storm, but there could still be a strong hurricane.
So what I guess Eric was getting ready to ask this, and did we already see a reflection of Zeta this season with Klaudette? I look back at that, and Klaudette was a very weak tropical storm that moved over us at the beginning of the season that had a track pretty much the same as Zeta.
Eric?
Yes. If you look at the advisories for Zeta versus the advisories for Klaudette, and you put them on top of each other, they were almost identical. And yeah, I mean, I've got a graphic in my computer. The lines for the two systems were so identical, it's almost eerie. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Well,
and it was right when it was supposed to be as well.
Eric, let's go back to Katrina. Katrina, that year's cycle was a long cycle, at least on my calculations. It was 74 to 79 days or so. And that year's the longest cycle I've ever had with the l.R.C. But Katrina happened, what was the date of Katrina? Do you remember the date?
29th, 2005.
Okay.
August.
So August 29th. You go back 75, 79 days before that, you had Tropical Storm Arlene in almost the identical spot as Katrina. Wow. So you have Arlene before Katrina. You have Cindy one cycle before major disaster Harvey. All right. And this year you've got Klaudette, likely an indicator of whatever Zeta Klaudette is going to become between September 13th and 23rd. The probability of a system coming into Louisiana near New Orleans between September 13th and 23rd is an 84% chance based on the analytics using the l.R.C.
And of course, it is climatologically also the peak of the hurricane season, but you're honing in on our area specifically. Let's talk about this. Let's kind of broaden out again with all of this, Gary. We've known for decades and decades about teleconnections in the atmosphere and how large-scale circulations connect with each other. We know about things like pattern repetition. We can see, for instance, just this summer, patterns setting up where we've had ridges over us, and then we continue to see this East Coast trough that's been developing. That's been going over and over. We know about things like the Arctic Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation, the NAO, the PNA, all of those kind of things. What does that have to do with the l.R.C.? I mean, are those are long-term circulations that don't change, over short amounts of time. Most of those, like the PDO and the NAO, they may stay in a certain state for years or even just for an entire year. How do those play together with your hypothesis?
Well, the l.R.C. is a pattern that sets up each year. So there's a unique pattern that's never happened before that sets up. El Nino, La Nina, Enzo, other oscillations that you talk about, the MJO, PNA, PDO, AO, NAO up there. Those oscillations likely have an influence on the LRC. La Nina and El Nino, I'm certain, have a significant influence. But the LRC, the river of air above us right now flowing, that is a river of air. It's a big cycling pattern over the whole northern hemisphere, and there's one over the southern hemisphere too. That has influences, but it sets up in October. El Nino could be in one phase, La Nina could be in one phase. It could be a weak or moderate La Nina forming again this winter, and that could go to neutral, or even to an El Nino, or completely change phases, and yet the LRC doesn't change. But the influences on it might have other impacts. The pattern up there is still cycling regularly to what happened in October. Right now, we are in the same pattern that set up last October, and these other influences are influencing it, but that's what they are, influences on something that's bigger. They may all be tied together into one big thing, but this river of air that our peers think is just chaos is far from chaos. There's complete order to it.
Now, would you say you set up that pattern? Okay, we see the pattern, the LRC last year. Say we went to an El Nino right now, where usually that means less hurricane activity. Would that dampen that pattern going forward? Where, okay, right now the expectation is we could have a storm return from Delta in about 2 weeks. Maybe it's just a little weak tropical storm or something like that. Those other influences, would that influence that pattern totally?
Yeah, Zach, you just hit it right on the nose, really. There will still be a reflection of these systems, but if El Nino is developing and there's increased shear over the tropics, so the chance of named storms become less likely, then maybe there's a reflection of it, and it's just a complex of thunderstorms. There have been years where I was predicting a system to come right across the Gulf of Mexico. And I had a company that we were working for at that point with Weather 2020, my company, and that we if we would have hit that forecast, they said, yeah, we would have continued with you. But that year, a system crosses the Gulf of Mexico, a spinning area of little showers, and it didn't manifest into anything. I'm like, form into something, because we predicted it. But there it was. The system was there. But that year, the conditions were not favorable for it to develop.
Well, and look at late July, early August. That was the last Zeta part of the pattern, and there was a ton of Saharan dust in place, and the atmosphere wasn't doing anything in the tropics. But yet you guys got a big rain event in Louisiana, and it went right up the East Coast. And if you followed its trajectory, it was right there with what Zeta did. It fit the pattern, even though it wasn't tropical in nature.
So does the LRC, and we can talk about tornado outbreaks and blizzards and all that as well, does this mainly work with big impactful events, predicting things like that? Because last year we had 30 storms, and I don't think you can find a relationship for each one of those storms that it related to the cycle. Is this more a tool for forecasting major events like a Zeta, like the big hurricane you're saying is going to happen in mid-September, or some of the huge tornado outbreaks you guys have up there in Kansas City?
First of all, David, I do believe there is an earlier indication for every one of those 30 systems. Okay, within the cycling pattern, there is something in previous cycles that would have at least a small indicator, a relationship to that. Overall, when we get to October and November, the pattern sets up. Same thing with winter storms. If there's a winter storm and you know the cycle length, you can predict when there's going to be another winter storm. This year, Oklahoma City, perfect example. They had a major ice storm at the end of October at the exact same time Zeta is coming into Louisiana. So you have Zeta coming into Louisiana, part of the pattern, and you have Oklahoma getting blasted by an extremely rare October major ice storm, which probably will never happen again in October in Oklahoma City. what happened 46 days later as we got into December? Oklahoma City has a snowstorm, and there's a reflection of Zeta. Either Zeta or Delta had a major snowstorm in the deep south in Texas and Louisiana. I think got some snow this year from the Zeta or the Delta part of the pattern. I forget, Eric, which one it was.
And you tweeted that, and the best part was you said, "What would you believe?" Basically, you know, it was like, "Would you believe me if this was because of this?" And you know, to anybody that's following this, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. To anybody that's not, it's
So I mean,
what?
But now, I need to go back and look at my tweet. I need to go back and look at my tweet to see what I wrote, because that is returning now. A snowstorm can be related to a hurricane. Isn't that amazing?
So, but let's talk about the cycle, the new cycling patterns that it begins in October, right? That's what we established. Right. So that means the predictability for October, November events aren't usually as good. Would that be right?
That is a very good assessment. Using the l.R.C, if you're a really good forecaster, maybe in October and November you do pretty good. But by the time you get to December, if you do December forward, especially January forward, then you get to the sweet spot of the l.R.C and you can make much better predictions. What's so funny, Zach?
October, November, we're in trouble.
I know. I've got a computer model. We have a great computer model. For example, our model, I don't know Japan's weather patterns. I haven't studied Japan's weather patterns, but I work at KSHB, the NBC affiliate here in Kansas City, and we had the Olympics on. So I made a prediction for the Japan Olympics months before. Our computer model did. Our model showed Japan getting hit by significant increase in precipitation in the first 5 days of the Olympics. And I didn't realize, and I still have to go study, but that tropical storm that headed into Japan a couple weeks ago was predicted by our model. Now, on the model, it just looks like an increased area of precipitation. Same thing with Klaudette. We have a model that shows Louisiana, New Orleans, getting an increased amount of precipitation. There's an art and science to what we do. The science, the model shows you this precipitation. The art, we know that it's probably a tropical storm that's coming in.
That's kind of my next question, because we had Eta and we also had significant Iota. Was Iota not part of this? Is it only specifically in a certain part of the globe? And, what can we look at the West Coast and figure out this is going to happen for them depending on what their weather is in October and November?
Let me look and see. I have my January prediction. Let me see if I wrote down Iota in here.
Because Iota was the last storm, right?
Yeah.
When did that happen? I don't have that in mind.
Like, how do you know when the pattern? How do you know when the pattern cuts off? When that l.R.C stops and then it starts repeating?
When was Iota? Do you know when Iota was exactly?
It was sometime in November.
Second week in November, I think.
Yeah, that. Let me hold just a second. I'm going to call it up.
All right. Well, while you're doing that, let me ask these questions, Gary. So you talk about the Northern Hemisphere. Has anybody tested this in the Southern Hemisphere? Or do you have any clue as to...
I know I haven't studied the Southern Hemisphere, but I do know that the Southern Hemisphere has a cycle too. I think it's related to the Northern Hemisphere. I just haven't studied it enough yet. Yeah, Iota, by the way, was November 18th. And it tracked, it was way down in the Caribbean. So it tracked across the South Caribbean, since it was almost, it's deep into fall, and went right into Mexico, produced tremendous flooding, and is a major hurricane in Mexico. But since it tracked way down there, there may be another one on schedule, but likely way down there, not targeting the United States, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. What about temperature trends? Does it work with temperatures, or does this just work with storms?
It absolutely works with temperature trends as well. For example, if there's an Arctic outbreak in November that is caused by mid-latitude synoptic setup, a big ridge in Western Canada that creates the conditions for the Arctic air, you can predict with reliability, just like the tropics, that there will be another Arctic outbreak right on schedule. And so we have very good success with predicting the Arctic outbreaks, severe weather outbreaks. I was on with James Spann with his Weather Brains a couple years ago when we knew that around Easter, we were on in February, and I said 45 days from now, around Easter weekend, you're going to have a severe weather outbreak. And he goes, okay, I'm going to write that down. And then, because James has been a skeptic of long-range forecasting, but what happened on Easter Sunday 2 years ago, significant outbreak, including his area in Alabama. So there's predictability, significant predictability for severe weather, Arctic outbreaks, heat waves, flooding events, droughts, tropical storms, hurricanes.
You know, and I think it's interesting you bring that up. And James Spann, of course, one of the most respected broadcast meteorologists out there in the country, has quite a wide following nationally. You know, and you talk about him being skeptical about long-range forecasting. I don't know if he's skeptical in general or just skeptical of the l.R.C. But a lot of people have pushed back against you, Gary, over the years. I've seen you having to fight for this. And one thing that any scientist wants is they want to be published, their research, and they want it to be in a peer-reviewed journal. That didn't happen for a long time. You know, and some of that, I think, is what we have to worry about is people getting caught in one mindset and one way of thinking. I mean, part of science is constantly questioning what's known, because we know there's unknowns out there that have yet to been discovered. What was your experience like? And you did eventually get published.
Well, fortunately, we got a peer-reviewed paper published, and it's called "The Cycling Patterns of the Northern Hemisphere." You can Google it and find it if you want to look for it. And I have an article that was published in Meteorological Technology International magazine a couple years ago. So it's great to have a couple of items published, because this is something that exists for everyone to see. It's in the 1940s from Jerome Namais when he began to discover it, to when I found it independently in the 1980s, to advancing it to now. Yes, there's skeptics out there. For example, just yesterday, AccuWeather has an article out about, there's a whole article about could there be atmospheric memory? Okay, could there be a memory of the atmosphere? And they showed Elsa's track and they're showing Fred's track. Is that just a coincidence? And the head forecaster at AccuWeather says, is this possible? And he says, a firm no. Okay, how does he know that? No, it's actually a firm yes, the exact opposite of what he says. But on faith, he's not going to believe it. On faith, our peers aren't going to believe it. We need more work, and I'm working on it, and more peer-reviewed papers, and we'll try to do that. But as a chief meteorologist on a TV station, how much time do you have to write a peer-reviewed paper? It's amazing I got one written. You know?
I'm not criticizing your work ethic, Gary. I have no doubt on that. Okay, whatsoever. Definitely not. Okay, so let's sum things up here. Eric, help me with my memory. So what are we looking out for next? We've got Fred, and here on the Gulf Coast, we've got potentially 2 additional threats. Is that right?
Yeah, so you've got Grace, which is in Vest 95 right now, and that would fit around the gamma part of the pattern. Of course, gamma kind of weakened as it lifted to the north. And then after that, you've got the delta part of the pattern. So, just kind of rounding out the next few weeks going into September, based on all of the information that follows the l.R.C, the ideas are these waves are going to want to focus in on the Gulf of Mexico, and each one kind of trending a little further off to the west. Gary, tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, the one that you're talking about now that has there's one out there, a 60% chance of cyclone formation. It's actually a system that has, Zach, to answer your question earlier, there's an indication of this next system that we have been spotting. It's one of our top 7 forecasts. This next one would be right on schedule for about 7 to 10 days from now. So we'll see. But that one would target that would target the east coast of Florida more directly. So this next one has a better chance of targeting East Florida. Eric, I'll send you my stuff, but it's pretty interesting.
Please,
that is definitely one of our top predictions.
And I want to follow up with a question, because we were talking about winter storms, temperature. Eric, have you done it? You've done it with the tropics. I know that. Have you done it during the winter with Florida? Now, I know y'all temperatures don't change that much, but have you seen Arctic outbreaks happen when they're supposed to, all the way down to Florida?
The one thing that Jeremy had me do this year was journal. As soon as we hit October, journal every day. High temperature, low temperature, rainfall, departure from average on everything. And take notes. And once we kind of locked into, the pattern's recycling, so this is this day, this is this day, I started seeing trends, and just for fun, I started putting out kind of broad monthly forecasts. Kind of saying, hey, this is where we have an opportunity to get some wetter weather. This is where we could be talking about some cooler weather. And one of my followers on my morning Facebook, Twitter, broadcast, blog, whatever you want to call it. He's an engineer retired, and he criticized, critiqued, whatever you want to call it. He gave me a 75% accuracy rate based strictly on the l.R.C, following temperature trends, rain trends. So it wasn't perfect, but frankly, neither is a 7-day forecast that any of us use, or a 10-day, at the end of the day, there's just inherently some things that change, but a 75% accuracy rate that I said late week, a month from now, plan on some storms. And asterisk, if it yielded severe weather, then the next time there may be a threat for severe weather. And there are, hey, we had tornadoes in Tampa, and then this cycle around, hey, we had a severe thunderstorm warning in our area. And the next cycle around, hey, there was hail in Tampa, so you're following these little trends. There is that organization to the chaos.
We need to start circling the calendar, David. We need to start circling the calendar.
Zach, I'm gonna let you do that on the calendar back at the office. Guys, this has been a great conversation. It's fascinating. Gary, of course, I've been reading about this and hearing about this from you for years, and I admire your determination and and your contribution. I think it's an interesting hypothesis and one that needs to continue to be tested. Now, we like to finish on the podcast with a question. You knew you were a weather geek when? Let's start with Eric.
So I'm working on getting tropical data into my weather computer. So I realized recently that I was just a geek when I found Microsoft Excel is the greatest tool on the face of the planet.
When did you first get interested in weather?
Hurricane Andrew, when it struck South Florida, and the world seemed to change here. Building codes and the world changed, and it's just never stopped me from it.
Now, Gary, yours is probably a little bit before Andrew, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, I was back in 1967 probably. When I was 5-6 years old, I became interested in weather. Don't even remember exactly how. When I was 10 years old, I created, because remember, I grew up in Southern California in Los Angeles, where the weather was really boring, but I didn't know it was boring. I thought it was the most exciting weather in the world. I didn't know you could get thunderstorms and tropical storms and hurricanes. I was like, wow, look, there's a cloud. All right, so it was exciting. But back then, I created my own little world in a circle, and I made 8 little towns, and I would draw in the weather maps, and then I'd practice. And my mom probably thought, what the heck is he doing? And I'd be like, all right, Area 1 has an increasing chance of showers this week, and there's a winter storm heading towards Area 2. And I'd be in my room creating this game. And I still have them somewhere in my basement, but that's when I became a weather geek.
Wow. Been creating and thinking ever since then. Great minds here today. Appreciate the conversation, everybody, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So we have the Lezak recurring cycle, the l.R.C. Wow, that is an interesting discussion. I've heard a lot about this from Gary over the years and read about it, and there are going to be a lot of skeptics out there. It's an hypothesis. That's all it is at this point in time. There is some empirical evidence for it, but again, I think it probably has a really long way to go. I think one thing that we want to emphasize, Gary, started getting a little bit hyped up there and used the Katrina word when talking about the pattern that we're in this summer. But again, let's kind of review specifically. Again, he said that this year's cycle, which started last October, is a 46.3 day cycle, and that we had Klaudette early in the season, right? We had Klaudette, and then what happened after that?
Okay, so Zeta is the reoccurring cycle. We hit Klaudette in the middle of June. And so it reoccurred at the end of July and early August. And this goes back to, this doesn't mean a hurricane's going to hit you every single time you reoccur that pattern. What did we see at the end of July, early August? We saw a cold front make it all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And there was an area of pressure that developed along the Louisiana coast and moved off to the north and east, almost like Zeta. So that's what was the reoccurring aspect of the pattern then. And now he said we're going to hit it again in the middle of September, so that's when we should be watching out for another type of low pressure, or could it possibly be some type of tropical system? We'll see.
Because that'll be 46 days later. And one reason, when we asked him, he said, well, why didn't we get a tropical storm or a hurricane 46 days after Klaudette this year? And, of course, he said, well, there was a lot of dry air. If you remember that part of the end of June, beginning of July, after a really wet June, we finished with a much drier atmosphere, and it wasn't as conducive for tropical cyclone formation. So obviously, this is nowhere near perfect. Neither is any kind of weather forecasting, because you can have very short-term pattern changes or conditions in the atmosphere that can make things more favorable or less favorable. And I don't know if we have the ability on a long time scale like he's doing to make these kind of predictions.
Exactly, and it's science. I mean, it's a hypothesis. Does it work out every time? And you always say this. It's the words of Brian Norcross. What is it? Say it again.
Precision is the enemy of accuracy.
So exactly. So, if you're precisely trying to say a hurricane's going to come, you're probably going to get it wrong. But an area low pressure in the Gulf, that's a tropical wave, or that's a cold front approaching the Gulf. So, that whole precision thing, that's the part that everybody's going to think it's wrong. But in the end, I think there is some kind of reoccurring pattern. But there's a lot of reoccurring patterns in the atmosphere. We know about the MJO. We know about PNA, the Arctic Oscillation. There's teleconnections. Everything's all connected together at once. This morning, I did that on my Tracking the Science segment of how everything on this earth is connected one way or another.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on there. And a reminder, everybody, stick with us here on Fox 8 and fox8live.com for the latest on Fred as we go throughout the next few days. And, of course, for the rest of the season on whatever develops in the tropics, regardless of the recurring cycle or not. For Zach Fredella, I'm David Bernard. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.